It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. That is Logan Paulsen. I am Craig Hoffman. And Logan, we have a 53-man roster. That roster is probably going to change. In fact, it might change by the time this podcast comes out. But we have a 53-man
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, congrats to the guys who made it. I know that's like a tough deal for some of those guys. Some of the young guys who made it, congrats big time, because a lot of people weren't expecting them to make it. So it's always a cool day for those guys, always kind of a bummer day for the guys who didn't make it. But, it's so funny, like when we were reviewing practice squad yesterday, it's like some of these like really good football players are given an opportunity to be around. Like think about when I was playing, it was 7 dudes. And if you didn't make the 7 dudes, like bye forever. And if you had any type of experience, bye forever. So now at least there's kind of this foster program where you can keep guys around. And guys, the cool thing about it, the promotion, demotion element of the practice squad is a lot of those guys are going to play football this year for you and get a nice game check. So yeah. I think that's pretty fantastic. And I love the new setup. And it makes cut day a little bit less stressful, I think, for me as an analyst watching it, because those guys are still going to be around.
Yeah, definitely. So for reference, because this is, to quote Martin Mayhew and Ron Rivera yesterday, a fluid situation. We are recording this Wednesday morning, so we do not know the practice squad yet, although we have a pretty good guess based off who was cut yesterday. But there's always a chance like someone that we expect to come back to the practice squad gets signed to another active roster, and that will kick off a whole firestorm that I will have talked about on the radio by the time this podcast comes out. So if you want the firestorm that we don't know about at this time, go listen to the Hoffman Show podcast, which of course we do every day on the Team 980 for 3 whole hours. Okay, but as for what we know, 53-man defense which we'll get to, is pretty predictable. But the offense, you get a couple of surprises. I think for us, that does not include quarterback. They do go with just the 2. I do think it's an interesting conversation, though, of like, Fromm was good enough that it's not outrageous to suggest that someone else could sign him. There is some level of risk in exposing him to waivers. So if he does get signed and someone else wants him to be either their 2 or their 3, but they're willing to do the 3 on the active roster bit, what's the move for Washington?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to kind of basically say to yourself, like, is there a way that we can retain him? Like, is there a way in negotiations that we can find a way to keep him around? A lot of times you can say, a big point of negotiation is saying like, oh, I'm making practice squad money. I'd like to make active money and stay. And that's something very easy to do. And I've seen that happen multiple times. Sometimes you can say, like if he really wants to be active, you really want that accrued season, you could probably move the roster around and try to keep him. But I don't think he'll get picked up. No offense to him. I just think there's a lot of kind of backup quarterbacks around. And there is this kind of like, I don't know what the word is. It's not confirmation bias, but it's like, proximity bias. Like, I know my 3rd string quarterback. I know he knows the offense really well. I like these things about him. And I don't know, Jake Fromm, for example. And so I think there is a tendency around the league to keep the devil as opposed to the devil you don't. And that's not always the best policy. But in my experience, like I've seen that happen, not necessarily with quarterbacks, but oftentimes with like running backs and receivers, and they go out and sign somebody else as opposed to keeping the guy. And more times than not, honestly, in my 10-year career, the guy that they brought in from a different team gets cut like within the week, and they re-sign the guy that was here during training camp because they kind of know the system, they know what's going on. So I do think there's a proximity bias with the quarterback thing. And, like I said, it's not the end all be all. Like they can find ways to keep him if they really, really want to keep him. And if you do leave, like that's where the scouting department has to kind of make their money, right? Who's available, who's like last year, I think a great example is like John Ridgeway. They're able to get John Ridgeway when they're trying to when Dallas is trying to bump him to practice squad, and you get a really good football player. And I think that if your scouting department's up, your pro personnel department's up and ready to go, like you can find guys around the league. Like Colt McCoy just got cut, and he's got practice squad eligibility under the new system. So if you want to bring him in, like go for it. You know what I'm saying? So I think there's, and he at that point in his career, which I think is year 12 for him. You want to kind of he's got to pick a spot he wants to go to, but that is an option now for you to kind of say, hey, this veteran just got cut. Let's bring him on practice squad. And so there's other options basically.
Totally. Right, which would be a kind of funny bit. Honestly, for week 1, I would bring in Colt and be like, tell us everything about their offense. You know, you might as well. He's basically like a coach. He was their one quarterback all spring long. So, and I'm sure Colt would love to be like, I hate you right now.
That's
Arizona.
such a weird move by them, but yeah.
Yeah, we might talk about that a little bit later in the show, depending on our time. But I think that, you know, the proximity bias is one thing, but there's also just the reality of the decisions that have been made over time, right? Teams pick their players in the spring. They don't pick their players in the fall. And so they decided in the spring, not just they, the Commanders, every NFL team, that these are the guys that we think are worthy of our 90-man roster. They then invest all spring long, all the meetings, all the OTAs, all the time on the field, all summer long, all training camp, all those meetings, all the time on the field into those players. They would like to keep them around. And so for equal talent levels, and whether that talent level is kind of freakish athlete like a Kaz Allen or someone like Jake Fromm, who's like limited but fine as an
some
NFL
potential.
quarterback.
He definitely showed some potential, right. And great.
Yeah, 100%. There's from a talent standpoint, there's a lot of Jake Fromms around. There's actually more than you'd think Kaz Allen's around. But the difference is in Washington, Jake Fromm knows Washington's system. And if you're anywhere else, he doesn't know your system. So signing him is probably not worth it. Now, there are teams that definitely need quarterbacks. New England is down to 1. They cut Bailey Zappi. They cut Malik Cunningham. And so they literally only have Mac Jones on the roster. So, they're going to sign someone, but you also think about, system familiarity. Maybe, I mean, Colt would make a lot of sense there. As a kind of a veteran to be in Mac's ear and be like, hey, dude, this is how business gets done in the league. But, you know, if you're Washington and all of a sudden you need one, you look at who Kansas City cut. You look at who I just actually looked at Jacksonville, and it's some guy I've never heard of. But, you look at the places that they're off the Andy Reid tree that run your system, run your stuff, maybe even someone who's passed through Kansas City in the past. And that's probably the play. But there's Will Greer that's out there. You know, there's a bunch of dudes out there that have some level of talent that if you want to bring them in, you could. But at the end of the day, the big point for anyone freaking out about Jake Fromm is even if they lose him, it's not the end of the world. Not even close. It's not even that much of a needle mover. And 2, they should very, very likely be able to.
So let's double click on that real quick. I know a lot of fans are like, oh, he's not a needle mover. I can hear them freaking out. I can see them freaking out in the comments already. Jake Fromm did a really good job in training camp. He did some really good things. He also did some things that are very indicative of his inexperience in the NFL, right? And he's not ready, I don't think, even to be a full-time backup just yet. He's still working towards that. Is he very talented? Yes. Does he have that gamer kind of moxie that this city loves? Yeah. Is he a little bit more talented version from a physical tool standpoint than Taylor Heineke? Yeah, but he's not there yet. And so I think that's exactly why you have the practice squad. You got a guy here who knows your system, who in a pinch maybe could come in and do a fourth quarter drive, whatever you need to do. That's what he's here for. But I think it's important to know that he's not quite ready yet, And I think that's who he is. And that's not a knock on him. He did everything you want him to do. He had a great preseason training camp. That whole cycle was great for him, but he's not there yet. And hopefully with a year on practice squad, staying in the system, learning the system some more, he gets there and you develop a talent and you have a guy that you feel really, really good about. And next year, maybe you don't need to re-sign Jacoby Brissett. You have Jake Fromm or whatever it is. I'm not exactly sure.
I think that's the goal, right? The goal is you have a good season. Sam's your starter and Fromm's the backup for a long time. And, he can be a viable backup because he'll have known the system. And no, the Heineke comparison, I think, is interesting because, it's he's better than Heineke and Heineke won all these games. No, his physical tools are better. But Taylor had been in Scott's system for so long that he could do, he maximized himself in that system. Fromm has not been in this system very long because no one has here in Washington. So I think that over time, if he really gets to know the system like the back of his hand, he could develop into a backup level quarterback. All right, that's probably enough time on.
Well, people want to know. We got to give people what they want.
Yeah, people want to know. Now you know. And by the way, I didn't know if I was going to say this, but I'm just going to say it. If you want to know whose football opinion that is worth listening to or not, Find the people that think that Jake Fromm is currently better than Jacoby Brissett and unfollow them. That is just a public service announcement from your friendly podcast and radio host. All right. Moving on. Running back. As we just kind of go down the list here. Not a lot to talk about. 3 guys that we anticipated. The interesting thing, if you will, is that Jonathan Williams gets IR'd. So we should have mentioned Derek Gore as a potential practice squad guy. It looks like he is going to go that direction. What do you make of Gore over Patterson as the practice squad running back? Because that is honestly the only thing that is even remotely not self-explanatory.
Yeah, I think the thing that was interesting about it was when I saw the cuts and I saw how they kind of timed them out. I was like, man, we forgot to mention Gore. And Gore should have been our obvious choice after Jonathan Williams, I think. I think Jonathan Williams had a better training camp preseason, did a really nice job. But Gore knows the system. He's explosive. He kind of fits all the criteria. He knows what EB wants, and there's value there. You know, he's played NFL football. He's played at football in Kansas City. He knows this offense. Like, that's worth a lot, in my opinion. And for a guy who actually had a pretty good cycle once he got here, you know, everyone saw him in the last game, breaking off those long runs. He's got a physical running style. He's quick. He catches the football well. Like, why not? You know what I'm saying? And
yeah, I think he's played a little teams as well, which I think is the separator between him and Patterson on top of the system.
Yeah, and I think you know, Patterson. I like Patterson. I think Patterson had a good offseason too. But there is something to be said. You know, it's like any job. Like, if I know you and we're boys and I know we can work together really well, like, I'm more likely to employ you or work with you or bring you in for the job. And I think, you know, Patterson's a great guy. You know, like, I've talked to him a little bit. He's like, his story's awesome. He's a good football player. He's going to be on a team, a practice squad at some point this year. But I think the Gore connection to EB, like, is probably the defining factor, even more than teams. Like, it's just, he knows him. He played well. He looked in good shape. He did everything he needed to do. So, you know, I think that's it.
Yeah, I mean, this guy played in 11 games in 2021, so he's got that NFL experience, which is helpful. All right, tight end. This is probably the biggest shocker to me on the roster. Is Curtis Hodges makes it. Hodges just frankly did not produce in camp, but as I've thought about it over the last couple of days, results not there. Like, for sure, he dropped too many balls. Like, his statistical production not very good. How did he progress though from like a route running, blocking, the things that we are going to have a harder time seeing just watching a preseason game? How did he progress there enough so that they thought this was?
Well, I think when you look back to last year, he's come light years. You know, he's in like in a totally different ballpark, and so I think he's good. He's good in line. He's not great in line. He's good in line. And I think that's something you can win with, especially when John Bates is your only true like blocking Y. I think he's probably, I'd say, the second best blocker in the room. So there's value there. And I still look at how he runs routes, man. I'm like, man, for a guy who's that big, for him, like everyone, you know, I think you made the Samis Reyes comparison on the last show.
Yeah.
And to me, it's not even in the same sphere, because he's so fluid. He understands leverages and coverages. He's got this really nice suddenness that you wish kind of Sam East had as a basketball player. So for me, I think he does some really, really good stuff. He does. Like, when you see his good stuff, it's amazing. The problem is that he just didn't, like, we talked about this a lot with him and with a lot of the guys, a lot of the young receivers too. Kaz Allen, same thing, is you want to see a certain kind of consistency and a certain kind of finish, you know, especially in the passing game and the run game as well. I will say in the third preseason game, I thought I saw a little bit of that finish in him. I thought I saw him running the ball a little bit more. He's around, like, you know, like one of the things I like to do is like when the camera's zooming in on the ball carrier, like who's in the vicinity, you know? And so you get a lot of Ricky Stromberg, you get a lot of, you know, whoever it is in there. Bryson Tremaine's a guy who likes to finish like that. And all of a sudden, like Curtis Hodges is in the shot. I thought he's pushing himself a little bit. And so maybe that's what they needed to see from him. But I really, when I look at him, like, he's a guy that, again, the reason he makes the roster, in my opinion, is, again, because I think he's progressed as a blocker. He's your second best blocker, blah, 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 blah. But he could be great. And that's the thing that I keep coming back to him is, like, there's a lot of guys like Dylan had a really good training camp, really, really good. But he is who he is. Much like myself. Like, his ceiling is, his floor is not very low. His floor is not very low, but his ceiling is not very high. Curtis, his ceiling is like a top 5 player in the NFL. Like, that's what his ceiling is. Now, Is he going to get there? I have no idea. He's got to figure it out. But I don't want that guy just on the street for anybody to come grab. I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. Is his ceiling is such that it's worth this little bit of progression you've seen from him. It's worth getting him on the 53, I would say.
Yeah, that's I think that's a difference in a lot of the guys that get cut in a guy like Hodges is if you cut a borderline player, most of the time that player, like maybe he shows up and he's a starter somewhere else and you're like, man, good for him. Very rarely is a guy who gets cut going to turn into a potential top 5 tight end in the league. And, I think that there is like a consistency to great players that I would say it's very unlikely he reaches that.
No, I agree.
Like super
I think
likely, but just to even have that possibility is tantalizing. And he didn't practice last year because he was on IR the whole year. So Ron said, like, we look at him as a rookie, as a developmental project. So we want to get him that practice time and ultimately play time. I do think there's concern about Logan Thomas for sure from an injury standpoint, whether it's this injury or whatever could potentially come next. But I think that, that potential is the difference for sure in him getting on the team. And he can give you something right now. But we'll see. It's one of those that they also didn't have another option if they wanted to keep a fourth tight end. So
Dylan, right?
Dylan's hurt.
He's on IR.
Yeah, I mean he got IR'd. So whether that's hey man, we want to keep you around for next year. You're gonna have a job in the spring.
Yeah.
You cool with this? Whatever that conversation is. Actually, I take that back. To add on to that though, I think there's a chance he shows up somewhere else this year because he was a guy that was mentioned as potentially getting an injury settlement. So he might get waived and ultimately be allowed to go pursue another job. But he does get IR'd initially. So if they've needed the depth, that's the kind of thing where when they talk about the fluidity of the roster, could they go get someone else? I think that's also possible depending on what they need right now. I also wonder too. They cut Arma, which we thought could happen. We talked about the exact situation that's happening on the last pod where Arma gets cut. They're going to bring him back. Do you let the initial wave of signings happen and kind of this chaos leading up to noon today and the waiver wire deadline, practice squads get filled, and then you cut Hodges in favor of Arma and hope that sneakily allows him to get back to practice squad? I don't know if that actually works, but it seems like it's on the table.
I think that, part of me is like, just cut him. If that's the plan, just cut him with everybody else. Hopefully he gets lost in the sauce a little bit.
Yeah.
But again, I don't want him going someplace else. As much as I was frustrated with his production this offseason, like he's gotten better. Like I've raved about his route running. The finish has to be better, but there's very few guys you get in free agency. And that's why it's so weird to be here with this team. You have Armani Rogers, who obviously is injured, who again has that skill set, and then Curtis Hodges. And it's like, how did you find both of these guys in addition to drafting Cole Turner, who's probably going to play a ton of minutes for you this year? Like, they are really, really lucky. And I think they're doing a good job of kind of saying, we know what we have here. We know we kind of hit the lottery. How do we maintain this while these guys develop? And if they do come around, we're going to be sitting pretty. We're going to have something that nobody else in the NFL has, is 3 young dudes who can all play, all catch the ball, all block well. And that is just something that I think as a coach is very, very tantalizing. So I think they're going to do whatever they can to keep him around. Like, to your point, is this kind of a way to get past that initial cuts, put him in a good spot? Perhaps, I don't know. But I think, again, to me, it's his talent, is his potential is what keeps him in the building. And I do think he's improved in some of those areas that maybe we can't see as reticently, his run blocking's gotten a lot better, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And by the way, if you catch wide, or if you drop wide open passes, at least you got wide open. So the route running is there. All right. So that's tight end. Offensive line. They go 9. Larson doesn't ultimately make it.
He'll be back.
They are going to bring him back. Fine. The one thing that I think is interesting, which I guess we'll get to, / we can just get to it right now, is where's the other roster spot though? Because we all anticipate Big Phil coming back, but if Arma's going to come back and Larson's going to come back, who's the other guy that's getting is Logan Thomas not close to coming back? I don't think so. He's been running around and starting to mix his way back into team stuff. And then the other one is Chase. He seems to be even more likely. Danny Johnson is another guy that maybe they could IR short term at defensive back. But yeah, man, I don't. It's just a weird thing that we're speculating on. I don't think it's even worth actually, now that I think about it, for the podcast, spending too much time speculating, because we might know by the time the podcast comes out. But what did you make of the initial decision, I guess, for 9 on the offensive
I was
line?
a little surprised because I thought, there was a pretty strong indication from guys like Kime, who is really dialed in, that there was going to be 10. And so I was like, well, Larson's going to make it. But obviously I think, like this is one of those like roster tomfoolery situations. You've got 2 really, really talented young guys that you like a lot. One's Curtis Hodges, one's Tinsley. And you say, how do we make that happen? Braden Daniels goes to IR. That is bad for Braden Daniels. You don't want guys getting hurt or whatever, but that allows you to keep Scott, who we both were kind of talking about as the guy you want to keep. And I think he's probably a little bit more valuable because he's got that tackle ability, and I think tackles are harder to find in the NFL. And who's the guy you got to get to cut? It's Larson. And so we've talked about Larson. We think he's tremendously valuable, but I think he's tremendously valuable to this organization because they see him every day. He's coming off a bad injury. Like I don't think teams know how he's been performing in practice on the day-to-day. So it's a little surprising, but ultimately, like, that's what I wanted to do, right? Or we wanted to do. We wanted to say keep 9, keep an extra receiver, and do that. And I think that's kind of, so I agree with this, but I think to your point, like getting him back up is going to be really interesting. And maybe it's like Scott and him are both like swing, and it's kind of depending on the week who's up, who's not, and you're bumping guys up and down to practice squad like that. I don't know, because I think Scott, because he's a rookie, his contract's not guaranteed day one. I think that's a thing. So like when I was playing, if you were a veteran, like if you had over 4 accrued seasons and you got signed to an opening day roster, your contract's guaranteed. So Larson would fit in that category and Scott would not. So maybe there's some kind of economic math there happening where we can flip these guys back and forth over the course of the season. I don't know. That's all speculation, obviously. But I think that's ultimately 9, I think, is the right thing to do, especially with Ricky Stromberg playing guard as well as he was. And I think you're in a pretty good spot. Like now it's just, I think to your point, it's like now who's shifting? Like how do you shift these guys up and down and not lose people you want to keep?
Right. Also, if I'm Trent Scott, I'm still nervous about the fluidity comments. He was good. Yeah. He deserves to be, like, we'll talk about it with Milne in a second. Like, all they can do right now is pick the best 53 from the guys they had. You pick 53 of 90. You can't pick from other teams yet. When that becomes an option, then you can make different decisions. And so for Trent Scott, is if there's another tackle that becomes available that they like, do they go out and snatch that guy up and Scott winds up either practice squad or going to another team in the future? We'll see. But he winds up making it, which I think is smart just from a roster construction standpoint, but we'll see ultimately how they get Larson back on the team, which brings us to wide receiver to close out the offense. And I mean, congrats,
babe.
He deserves it. And it's the kind of thing that I love to see. I love to see meritocracy. I think it's the best thing about training camp is when you see a guy who just consistently shows up and makes plays and just forces his way onto the roster. And that's what Tinsley did. He forced his way on because he was good basically every single day. And what his role is going to be, I have no idea. He might not even be active on game days. But he deserves to be on the team, and so he's on the team. Good for him and good for them.
Yeah, and he's a guy that, just like has been a consistent player, and coaches speak very, very highly of him. And I think you're seeing that come to fruition a little bit here, because of how he's produced, especially in the last game. But yeah, like what is his role going to be? I have no idea. Like right now, to me, he's Dax Milne like light, and I think you hope that he can develop into more than Dax at some point. But I think, like when you talk about special teams coaches' eyes light up about him. I haven't seen that from him. Like there's certain guys you watch, like for example, in the joint practice, like Bryson Tremaine. I'm only bringing him up because like they're both rookies. They both do the same stuff. Like in terms of team's value, Bryson Tremaine is an animal. You know what I'm saying? He's a big physical dude. He's like in the double vice drill, he absolutely smoked one of the vice guys in the Baltimore practice, like knocked him to the ground type of stuff. Like he's just got a different physicality to him. Tremaine, that's not his cup of tea. Maybe you feel like he can return punts for you at some point. I know when I was watching film of him after they signed him, he was in an All-Star game and returned punts in the All-Star game. Now, the thing that I would just say, like, hold up, wait a minute, is because like he didn't get any reps doing that in the preseason. And I would have liked to see that if that's something that you're planning on doing. Because I do think he's got some, like in watching those, it was 5 returns, so not a lot of returns. But he has some ability to do that. So like, why not, if this was in the cards, why not give it a look? Would be my question to that. You know, because like right now, like I don't see how he's active on game day. I think Pringle's active. I think Dax is active because he's going to return punts for you. And I don't really understand. Like, it feels like a missed opportunity a little bit. You know, if this was the way you wanted to go, like just to see how he looks, because I know he does it in practice. I've seen him do it at practice. So why not just see him do it live and in living color, like, you know, for a quarter or whatever? I don't know. You know what I'm saying? So just a kind of a weird that I'm not being critical of the staff. I know there's a million other variables that go into making this decision. He deserves to make the team, but I would like to know if he could do it. I think would be my one comment on that.
For sure. He did return punts in college, barely. He returned 5 as a freshman at Western Kentucky. Then he transferred to Penn State. He didn't return any his second year at Western Kentucky. And then his last year in school at Penn State, he returned 4. He has a total of 9 career returns for 10 total yards. So not exact for those that like Dax Mills' punt return stats. Let me introduce you to Mitchell Tinsley's college stats. They look extraordinary.
But in the All-Star game, I think he had like a 25-yard. You know what I mean? Like there's something there, but
it's all about
I would have liked to see him just do it in the preseason. Like and that's the thing. Usually coaches are pretty good about getting a bead for the roster and like where it's at and being like, this guy has a shot. So let's get him an opportunity at the stuff we want to see him do. And so the fact he didn't get it makes me think that they don't want him to do that. And if that's the case, then how do you contribute on teams? Like, are you, usually receivers, if you're going to contribute on punt, you're a gunner, right? He didn't do it really any of that, or he wasn't very good at it, and that's fine. He's not a huge body guy who's going to cover kicks.
Yeah, and your gunners are set. Like Holmes and Butler.
It's just interesting,
guys.
like how he contributes, and maybe they don't plan on him contributing. But again, congrats to him as a receiver. He definitely deserved it. Definitely did a great job. Yeah. But I'm just curious. It'd be curious to kind of keep an eye on that and his development, his role within in the team.
Let me ask you this: is there one of the receiver spots that you trust him over Milne right now, where you would be like, oh, hey, we need someone to go in at X, at Z, at Zebra?
Oh, that's a good question. I think Dax is pretty good. Like, I think when you look at his training camp at F, he's probably, or Zebra for them is what they call it. He did a great job. I think he could play.
That's the slot for those not familiar with the
zoo. Right. And then I think he could play Z. I guess maybe he's got some X qualities. I didn't see it. I didn't see that like X receiver guy. Like in terms of skill sets, I think you'd probably put Jahan there maybe before. And like traditionally the body type is like Bryson Tremaine, like that 6'5" freak that's going to stand. And he plays X, right? But he's not ready to be on the roster yet. So I'm not saying they should have done that. But to me, him and Dax are very, very similar. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that flexibility and that route running nuance just says, hey, like, you can really play any of the spots because your route running nuance is so high and you're a smart guy and you know multiple spots. And, we talk about position flex a lot with the O-line, but for those backup receivers, like the dude that's going to play first usually knows a ton of spots. Like, so, Diami's probably more of an outside guy, which means Dax is going to play a lot of inside. But, if something happens to Diami, I trust Dax and Tinsley for that matter to be able to step in at any of the spots. Yeah. And so maybe that's kind of what you're looking at there is you just get two dudes who are just really good receivers, sure-handed, and kind of get the finer points of route running. And we've talked about how like Jahan has excelled in this offense because he's such an excellent route runner. These guys are very much in that mold, Dax and Tinsley. They're very much in the mold of, they're not like height, weight, speed guys. They're like, kind of, they're like 6 foot. They're like 200-ish pounds.
Yeah. But they're
very, very technically sound. And so that allows you to do multiple things. I also think they're pretty tough guys, and like when you're playing that, and you got to come in, like you mentioned this before, like when you're the 5th receiver, 6th receiver, you can't be beneath like go and put your face on a safety. And I think both those guys are willing to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's how Cam Sims made his living for a long time. By the way, Cam Sims cut by the Raiders,
Oh, wow.
surprisingly, so he's available. But, Ryan Grant,
Yeah.
forever when he was here, everyone couldn't stand him as a receiver, and he always seemed to be 1 yard short of a first down, but he'd go dig out a safety, and that gets you a long way with the coaches, which is why Jay loved him. So, that's that part of it. I would say for the punt return part, I do think they wanted the Kaz Allen thing to work so bad. And up until the final game, it looks like it was. Like, if Kaz has a good final game, I think he's on this team, whether it's over Dax or over Tinsley, I don't know. But they wanted to give him every opportunity and figured it would work out. It doesn't. It backfires. Now, all of a sudden, you have a guy in Tinsley who you didn't give those opportunities. And it's just, them's the breaks sometimes. The reps, there's only a certain number of them. It's a finite number. And you do your best, and sometimes, it doesn't really.
That's actually a really good point. I think.
All right.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that. Like, you're trying to make it go for a guy who's very talented, and then it doesn't.
I mean, in some ways, it's like Ron's comments on Howell, right? Is like, I wish we would have played him. Well, there wasn't the opportunity to. Like, in hindsight, it's really easy to be like, yeah, definitely shouldn't have played Carson in that game, or maybe we should have just sacrificed the season on some level. But when you're in the middle of a playoff push, you're not going to put a rookie out there. And so, I think the circumstances of the wide receiver competition were Kaz got hot in the middle of camp. It looked like he was going to make the team. There was no reason to take away those opportunities from him. And all of a sudden, he bombs the final preseason game. And you're like, oh, crap. Now he's not making the team, and we never got Tinsley any.
And to be fair to the staff, it was that game, and then also in the Baltimore practice, it wasn't super sharp for him. So I think it was kind of a combination of like, hey, trending up really hard, kind of plateaued, and then it looked like he was regressing a little bit. So I think that's really good analysis for sure.
Yeah. So, could they have said like, hey, maybe we should, as a backup plan, give Tinsley some reps, but there's only so many reps.
And you want to see, and like what Tana says this all the time. He's like, with a punt returner, I want to see him catch punts. And if you think Kaz is the guy, that's exactly right. Get him out there, get him catching as many punts as you can, and see if it goes. And so obviously it didn't happen the way they wanted to. He'll be around. Obviously, I think he's on practice squad for sure. And we'll know for sure by the time this comes out. I would be
surprised. Yeah, I would be surprised if he's not. Obviously he could get picked up somewhere else, but they definitely want to bring him back. And by week 6, week 7 in the season, could he have caught enough punts that they feel comfortable with it in practice that they elevate him to the active roster? Sure. Yeah. Or if Dax, God forbid, we always talk about Dax being sure-handed. I'm like, oh man, if he ever drops a punt, my Twitter mentions and our comments are going to be 8 to 6. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. That's Logan Paulson. I am Craig Hoffman. If you're not subscribed, what are you waiting for? It's football season. Let's go. Get on it. Subscribe wherever you are watching or listening right now. All right, Logan, the defense. This is pretty straightforward. The 11 D linemen, check. Got them all. No surprises. 4 linebackers, check. Got them all. No surprises. Same thing with the 10 DBs. What is there anything though that you're kind of looking for now that you think is interesting in terms of the rotation, in terms of, obviously we think Big Phil is headed for short-term IR. Like what do they do at that spot? Like what are the interesting things to kind of look at from the way this roster is constructed?
Yeah, I just think probably for the defensive line, who's going to be active on game day. Right now, it looks like it's probably going to be Andre over KJ. And then if Phil is hurt and he goes to IR, is Abdullah Anderson up on the 53 or Benny Potuaye up, for week 1 against Arizona. I think both those guys are really good football players. I think, like they've had really good camps, and I'd be happy for them to get that opportunity. Also, I think the rotation is kind of interesting because you have, such great depth on the edge, and that's great. That's what you want. But, what do you do on the interior? How much interior line does James play or does FA play? Like that'll be kind of interesting to see that utilization package. And then, Chase's health, I think, is the other one that's really interesting to me because this, whatever's going on seems to be lingering a little bit. He's got, 10 days or whatever it is to get it worked out, which is a long time in football injury land. So hopefully it gets worked out, but hopefully that all resolves and you get a very nice rotation with Chase, Montez, Casey, and James. But if not, I think you feel pretty good about Casey and James coming in and playing good football for you because they have a track and FA. I keep forgetting FA, but those three guys have a track record of playing good football for this team, and the defense has been very successful when they're in. So I think ultimately, like if there is an issue long term with Chase, I think you feel very good about those back three guys, making plays for you and executing the defense, and it'll just be interesting to see how they use those young guys. I think, how much does Dre actually play, or is he just a team's guy to start? So in terms of storylines, those are kind of some I'm keeping an eye on.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting of like, does Andre Jones get on the field?
Right.
Because I think you saw in that third preseason game the difference of like James Casey FA versus an Andre Jones. I mean, it's like James' ability to push the pocket and to like string out run plays, like the power he plays with, I think showed up a couple times in that game. You see Casey's, ability to get around the corner and the pursuit speed and the intelligence that he plays with, always being in the right spot. And then FA, like I think FA is one of the most interesting guys to talk about on this D-line group because like James was the starter most of last year. He was the guy that got the most reps and was the starter. But by the end of the year, it kind of feels like FA might have been the best of the three. And certainly the way it played out this spring and into the summer, I feel like he had the best offseason to the point that, when I, in a tweet the other day on Cutdown Day was like, thank God they're not cutting any of these guys, to cut James or Casey or FA would be silly because they're borderline starters. And I was quote tweeting John. And so Keim tweets back. He's like, one note, FA was never on the block. Like it was never the three of them. It was the two of them.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting how FA separated himself and like ultimately to see what that means once we get into the season.
I think it makes a lot of sense because when you look at FA and you watch practice and you watch the preseason, FA rushing from that three technique spot is dangerous, man. Like he is excellent doing that. Like I remember the first probably 6 practices, like he was going up against, whoever it was, Charles and Paul and Cosme even. And he's so quick and he understands and he's got a nice physicality to how he plays. I think he's like 285 pounds. He's a big man. And again, he's not great against the run in there, but like having a guy who can rush from the three technique is a huge deal. And you're always looking for that edge rusher that can transition inside and do it. They tried it with Chase when he was a rookie, like just trying to find ways to
They tried it with Chase earlier in camp, and then Chase got hurt, and so that could still be on the table. Sure,
but I think that's to me the thing that separates FA from James and Casey. And then when you watch him rush the edge, he's got this kind of he's not an elite pass rusher, but he has elite power to his rush. And when you're looking at pass rushers, you're like, what do you do really, really well? Which was one of the reasons it was nice to see Casey kind of come alive a little bit in that last game because he's so quick, he's so explosive. He's like, when you look at his RAS score compared to the other D linemen, it's like second only to Montez, which is crazy. But so it was nice to see him kind of come alive a little bit and see some of that athleticism and that confidence in the rush. Because you say, okay, if he gets some opportunities, he can create some pressure, create some quarterback hits. And James, I got to give James a shout out. The power that he plays with is elite, but it's not quite as explosive as, let's say, FA. So I think that's that. And you got to see all those guys, FA rushing inside, winning rushes on the inside was great. Casey's explosiveness on the edge, James's power. Like you have to see them all kind of do what they're going to do. But I think the thing that separates them right now is that FA is just a better, more consistent pass rusher in terms of winning. So, and that can change obviously, but I think that's why he was kind of established as that definitively third guy because of that inside-outside ability.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then, the Chase thing is worth monitoring. Ron said the other day, like, we're not going to talk about that. We're going forward right now with the guys that we have and, just wanted to talk about practice and, he just wanted to talk about the game on Saturday when he was asked about it. And it just seems like there's a lot of tension there. It seems like there's stuff going on, which unfortunately has kind of been the story of Chase the last 2 years, where there was frustration with the knee and they thought he was going to be back maybe even to start the season. Then it became very clear no, and he doesn't come back till November, December. Like, I don't know. It's always longer, more prolonged, and more frustrating and more dramatic than it feels like it needs to be. I don't know whose fault that is. I do not know enough. I don't want to speculate because it is bad communication between Chase, the doctors, Ron. Like, is it Ron just like wishing too much? Like, I have no idea why there is this consternation around it, but it definitely seems like, again, with an injury to Chase Young, there is, there is consternation around it. And so
Sure.
we'll see if he's ready for week 1. Linebacker situation, they keep 4, pretty straightforward. The 4 we expected. Dejon Harris is probably going to be on practice squad and is a guy that you could definitely call up and play teams. But I think the interesting thing for me at linebacker, Logan, I mentioned this on my First and 10 on the radio show the other day, and I'm curious to run this by you real quick. I'm not entirely convinced after the way that Barton played in the spring and summer that Jamin at the mic and Kalik out there with him isn't the best linebacker combination for this team.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've talked about a little bit off air, is just like, is that the way you want to go? And I don't know. I think you pay, Cody's the free agent. And I think Cody's very, very talented. But, when you talk about Kalik, when you watch Kalik, when he plays, it's kind of since the Dallas game, he's flashed, he looks good. So I think they're going to let that, it could be like, what it was, William Jackson III. It could be kind of like that. Like he comes in, he's not where they want him to be. And then slowly they kind of start splitting reps and Kalik gets to play more and more and Jamin's playing the mic. And I think that would be that's not outside the realm of possibility. I think they're going to do everything they can to get Cody to go. I think when you see him, he's big, he's physical, he's talented, right? But ultimately, it's going to come down to play. It's the same thing with William Jackson III, right? He was big, physical, talented, but the defense just never clicked for him. And I think Cody's a different type of person than that. I think he's a little bit more competitive at this point in his career. He wants to see it go, but. Like I think that's entirely possible. And, Mayo always finds ways to play for this team on defense, because he knows what to do. He's physical versus the run. He's a little bit of liability in the pass game, but like at least he knows what's happening. And I will say, coaching high school football, like I want the dude who knows. Like there's guys that are way more talented, but they don't know what the heck's going on. Like you're not going to play because I can't trust you to do the simple things. And I think that's one of the things about Mayo and Kalik is they've been in this defense for a long time, and it seems to have clicked for Kalik. Mayo's been super consistent his whole time being here, and it's clicked for Jamin. So hopefully Cody comes on sooner rather than later, and this isn't an issue. But if it kind of lingers into week 4 or 5, like I could see them kind of saying, hey, we need to make a switch, and I think that's entirely plausible.
Yeah. All right. Defensive backs. I think it's going to, again, interesting on the roles here. Like how much does Butler get on the field? What do they do with Quan? Do they start to narrow his role and that allows him to be more successful? And then I think this is also a spot to watch one of the short-term IR guys in Danny Johnson. He's been out there running around on the side fields and everything. And the vibes have been very different, let's say, on Danny than they have been on Chase when Ron gets asked about it. But like you can go out and run around with a shoulder injury. The question is, can you tackle? And so that is a spot to watch. They also kept they have 3 guys that I think are, quote unquote eligible as we're saying it for the practice squad. 3 guys that they cut on, Tuesday, where Ron said like, these are the guys that we cut on Tuesday that we are going to try to bring back: Whiteside, Whitaker, and then Wild Goose. So if your cornerback with the name starts with W, congratulations, you might be on the practice squad. I feel like keeping all 3 would be silly, but 2 of the 3 seems likely.
How about Whitaker, man? Holy cow. Late signing, comes out in balls, does what he's supposed to do. Good for him. And then you mentioned Whiteside. Like he's been awesome kind of since day one. And then Wild Goose in the slot has been awesome, but outside has been a little bit up and down. So I think all those guys deserve to be back. And, like you said, maybe it's a little bit silly, but I think with Tinsley making the roster, think about it. You're only keeping 2 probably practice squad wide receivers. I think that's Tremaine and Allen.
The only guy that Allen, this is alphabetical order, not positional order. All the cornerbacks are just looped together because they literally all start with W. Looking at this list. But I think that you keep Allen and then you keep Tremaine for sure.
And then with like the O-line, we kept 4, but I think they're just going to keep 3. I think it's Jones, Smith, Brooks, and Laufenberg. I think Montero, because he was an early cut, may not come back. He might, but I think that's 3, and so you can keep an extra DB now because the allocation of resources is shifted.
Well, then you got the safeties. You've got Terrell Burgess and Kendall Smith are both on that list as well.
Yeah.
So of the 5, like I feel like of those 5, you keep 4, and the question is which 4 do you keep?
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to speculate too much because like they're going to know when this podcast comes out. But I do think
are we going to be correct? Here's our speculation.
Here's the speculation. You can let us know. I think you want to keep a young guy and keep an old guy at safety. I really do, and I think because of the 11 defensive linemen on the active roster, I don't think you have to do anything crazy because like you don't have to keep an extra edge on practice squad. They're both on the active roster. They're Andre Jones and KJ Henry, Casey Toole, James Smith Williams. Those are your practice squad guys, right? So, Benny and Abdullah, like they'll be there. Great.
Yep.
And then I think that extra, that William Bradley King spot maybe goes to Kendall Smith or whoever. And I think you can make that work. And because there's some young talent there, I know they're very high on him. So that makes sense to me that you could keep all 5 of those guys potentially and have a pretty stocked room, especially like when you look at like where the value is in terms of roster construction now. It's at, offensive line. They're going to keep 3. I'd say receiver. They have 2 young guys who I think are very talented that we're both very high on. And then you say it's DB. And so let's keep a bunch of DBs because Wild Goose, he played last year. He got bumped up a couple times, especially given Kendall's injury history, especially given Benjamin St. Juste injury history, especially given Cam Crow's injury history. Like, let's keep some guys around that we trust to play some football because, again, this is like your active, not active group. You know what I'm saying? Like 2 of those 5 guys are going to play a lot of football for you. And the rest of them are kind of developmental pieces, I think.
Right. No, and that's the mix of the practice squad, right? The mix of the practice squad is you want some guys that are developmental projects and some guys that are basically extensions of your 53, guys that you can call up at all times. And so they've got a good mix of that potentially available. There were 20 guys that got cut on Tuesday. Of that, 16 will be back on the practice squad. Theoretically, they obviously could also go other directions if there's a guy elsewhere that they can convince to come to their practice squad that they like. But you also have on that list of 22 guys in Larson and Arma who are going to get re-signed. So it's really how do you get that 18 to 16? And I think William Bradley King could be one of them. And then if you go 4 of the 5 DBs, that's kind of your list. So we'll see. All right. That's 45 minutes of football talking, Logan.
There we go.
Did it again.
We did it again. Who would have thought?
Next week, we'll get you ready for Arizona. How about that?
How about them apples?
Probably have a podcast out for you Tuesday morning. Obviously, Monday is the holiday, so we'll see if we can record something before that. Perhaps a mailbag. So if you made it this far, submit your mailbag questions. You can do it via the comments section at 1067 The Fan, where you subscribed on YouTube. Yes, you subscribe. Hit the button. Subscribe right now. You can also tweet me at Craig Hoffman. You can shoot Logan a message on Instagram at Logan_Paulson82. So we'll dive into a mailbag and then get you ready for Arizona next week. I got a couple things cooking on who might join us. So I think we're going to have a guest for at least one of the shows next week as well. Of course, take 5 on the off days, and then we're in our regular season rhythm. So after the game on Sunday, we will be doing our post-game pod and then tape review and then preview and rinse, repeat for the rest of the season. That's Logan. I'm Craig. We'll see you next time on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.